Good morning, class. This is ECON 353 Macroeconomics class. Today is February 10th, Thursday. The class will move on to Chapter 6 of your textbook. So, main topic of Chapter 6 is the gross domestic product. In abbreviation GDP. So how to compute the GDP? It's a national income, the most widely used term of national income. So we are going to discuss how to compute GDP and how to consider the inflation component of national income and so on. So here are the subtopics of today's discussion. Number 1, expenditure approach of national income determination. 2, Bureau of Economic Analysis procedures for calculating real GDP. 3, income approach of GDP. 4, real GDP. 5, limitations of GDP. Here are the video clips of a subtopic.
Suppose it's your job to calculate the gross domestic product for the United States. How would you do it? Start with the definition. The gross domestic product is the market value of all final goods and services produced in the United States in a given period of time, say 1 year. That is, it's the total value of all of the economic transactions that occur in the United States. Now, think about an economic transaction. Every one of them involves two parties. There's a buyer and there's a seller. And what's happening in every one of these transactions is the buyer is spending money and receiving in exchange for this expenditure goods and services. You can think of any transaction that occurs either as a spending decision by a buyer or as the receipt of income or money by a seller. That is, spending and income. It's one transaction, but it can be viewed from either of two perspectives. That is, every time something is bought or sold in our economy, a seller gets income that is equivalent to the amount of money that a buyer has spent to get a good and service. So you can either add up all the buyer's activity, that is, all the spending in the economy, or you can add up all of the seller's receipts, that is, all of the income in the economy. But these two are equal in every case. Spending equals income by the nature of an economic transaction. So there are two ways to calculate GDP. We can add up all the spending, that's called the Expenditures Approach, or we can add up all of the income that's received by sellers, that's called the Income Approach. In this lecture, what we're going to do is look at the Expenditures Approach. That is, who are the agents in the economy who are spending money? And how do economists think about expenditures? And when you add up all of this spending and get real gross domestic product, what have you learned about the economy? So let's start by making a list of all of those agents who act as buyers, that is, all of the agents who are spending on goods and services produced in our economy. Let's start with households. Households purchase goods and services, that is, they purchase goods and services that they enjoy consuming, and we call their spending consumption spending or consumer spending. Now, in 1999, the gross domestic product of the United States was $9.2 $978 trillion. Of this amount, $6.3037 trillion was consumer spending. That is, consumer spending accounted for 68% of the total gross domestic product of our economy. Consumers buy typically 2/3 of what the economy produces. That's consumer spending. Anything that a household buys except for a new home. The second category of spending in our economy is that spending that's associated with businesses, and we call this spending investment spending. Now, this is a bit confusing if you're used to using the word investment to refer to money you put in the bank or money that you put in stocks. But an economist calls that savings. Whenever you decide to put money aside and save it rather than spend it, then you are saving. But when a business, a factory, a firm, buys a new drill press or a computer or builds a new plant or acquires equipment, we call that business spending or investment. Now, we want to make a distinction here between gross investment and net investment. Gross investment is the total amount of real spending that a business does in a year. All the plant, all the equipment, all the computers. However, some of that spending goes to replace goods and services that have worn out. That is, some of the capital goods that you purchased earlier have now deteriorated or depreciated. And some of the spending that you do goes to replace those depreciated goods. What's left over is net investment. And net investment is an increase in the capital stock. That is, after you've subtracted from gross investment the amount that is depreciated in the capital stock, you then have left over the net increase in capital stock, which is available to make more goods and services. So net investment measures the rate at which an economy's capital stock is increasing. The third component of gross domestic product spending is government spending. This is the spending of state, local governments, county governments, school boards. Anytime that a governmental entity buys goods and services, we call that government spending. And government spending is more autonomous than the other components. That is, the government can increase its spending or decrease it in order to influence the economy. That is, government spending often acts as a policy variable. The government will spend more money to try to stimulate the economy or reduce spending to slow down the economy. The final component of gross domestic product from the point of view of expenditures is net exports. Now, this term might be a bit confusing. Let me see if I can make it clearer. Whenever foreigners buy products that are produced in our economy, that is, when we send goods abroad in exchange for their money, we call that exports. Whenever businesses, households, and the government buy goods that are produced abroad, sending money overseas and bringing goods into our country, we call that imports. Now remember, our concern is to figure out the total amount of money that is spent on goods and services made in our economy, in this country. Therefore, we take the total amount that foreigners spend on our goods, that is, our exports, and we subtract from it the total amount that consumers, businesses, and the government spend on goods that are produced abroad, that is, our imports. Our exports minus our imports gives us net exports, or the total amount of goods and services produced in our economy that we're selling to foreigners. Now, add up the components and you get total spending in the economy. The spending of consumers, businesses, the government, and foreigners adds up to total spending, which we usually represent with the letter Y. Now, we can look at some numbers in the economy to see how these factors actually figure in the real world. As I've already said, in 1999, the nominal gross domestic product was $9.2 trillion, of which 68%, or $6.3 trillion, was consumer spending, about 17% was spending by businesses, and about the same percentage, 17%, was the spending of government, and net exports was actually negative 3%, because the United States right now is actually importing a fair bit more than it exports. So this component of gross domestic product right now is negative. If you add all these together, you get about $9.2 or $9.3 trillion for our gross domestic product in 1999. These are the nominal gross domestic product numbers. The economist is going to be more interested, however, in real gross domestic product. So to convert these gross domestic product numbers into real terms, to measure the actual amount of stuff that households and businesses and the government buys, to measure the changes in the amount of output in the economy over time, we're going to want to hold constant the effect of changing prices. So the first thing we do is we find a gross domestic product deflator for 1999. And that means choosing a base year, which the government has done for us in its statistics. 1996 is the base year, and the gross domestic product deflator for 1999 is 104.46. That is, the average price level increased by about 4.5% between the base year and 1999. Now, divide the nominal gross domestic product of $9.2978 trillion by 104.46, and you get the real gross domestic product for 1999 using 1996 prices. And that number is $8.9008 trillion. This is the number that we'll be using to look at how output and spending are changing over time. So, here you have it, the Expenditures Approach to calculating gross domestic product. Add up the spending of all the different sectors of the economy, the real spending of these sectors, and you get real gross domestic product for the country. Let me write down an equation that you'll see a lot in microeconomics. Total spending equals consumer spending plus business spending plus the government spending plus the net spending by foreigners, net exports. Add them together, and you get the Expenditures Approach to calculating real GDP. A country's gross domestic product is defined as the market value of all final goods and services produced in that country in a given period of time. And the real gross domestic product seeks to hold constant the effect of changing prices as we look at how a country's output changes from one year to another. That is, when gross domestic product changes, part of the change is due to a change in market values, that's prices. And part of the change is due to a change in the physical output of goods and services in that economy. So we invent the concept of real gross domestic product, which tries to isolate the effect of increasing output and hold constant the effect of prices. Let's look at an example to remind ourselves of how real gross domestic product works. And as we work through this example, we'll see a problem that arises in the course of calculating the change in real gross domestic product from one year to another. Let's start with year one. In year one, let's suppose that we have two goods produced in our economy, apples and oranges. And the price of apples is $1 a piece, and 10 apples are produced, for a total market value of $10 from apples. Let's suppose that the price of oranges is $2 a piece, and the quantity produced is 10 oranges, for a total market value of $20 from oranges. $10 in apples plus $20 in oranges gives us a gross domestic product for this economy of $30 in year one. Now consider year two. In year two, let's suppose that there is a big increase in orange production, perhaps due to some new technological advance that allows oranges to be produced at lower cost. What happens in this case is that the quantity of oranges produced increases to 20 oranges, and the price falls through the interaction of supply and demand. That is, the surplus of oranges pushes down the price so that oranges now sell for $1 a piece. 20 oranges at $1 a piece gives us a market value of $20 from oranges. Over here in apples, let's suppose we still have $1 per apple and 10 apples produced, for a total market value of $10 from apples. $10 plus $20 means that our gross domestic product for year two is $30. Now, we know that our economy became more productive because there are more oranges being produced because of this technological advance that I described. But what is the actual increase in real gross domestic product? By what percentage did the physical output of our economy expand? How much better off are we in terms of the quantity of goods and services available to meet our wants and needs? Well, the percentage number that we wind up with depends on the base year that we select for our price weights. Let me see if I can give you the intuition of this problem. Suppose you work for a company that moves furniture, and your boss pays you $50 a day. The next day, you come to work and the boss says, "Good news, I'm giving you a raise to $100. The percentage increase in your wage is 100, the new wage, minus 50, the old wage, divided by 50, the old wage, for a percentage increase of 100%. Now, suppose the next day you come back to work and the boss says, "Sorry, I've got bad news. That is, your wage is going to be cut to $40. You do a quick calculation, $40, if this is your new wage, minus $100, your wage from the previous day, divided by that $100 base rate, gives you a percentage decrease of 60%. You complain to your boss, "I was making 50, then you gave me 100, now I'm cut back to 40. I'm worse off than I was before." And the boss counters, "No, I gave you a 100% increase and only a 60% decrease. You shouldn't complain." Well, this is ridiculous, isn't it? And it points out a problem with the calculation of percentage changes. Percentage changes depend entirely on where you start. That is, the base with which you calculate that percentage determines the amount of the percentage change. We're going to see this problem now as we look at a change in real gross domestic product. The percentage change that we wind up calculating depends on where we start. That is, which year we choose for our base. Suppose we want to calculate the percentage change using the year one prices as our weights. Well, look at this. In this case, we keep the year one prices of $1 for an apple and $2 for an orange. And we use the year two quantities of 10 apples and 20 oranges. If we do this, multiplying $1 times 10 and $2 times 20, we get a real gross domestic product using year one prices as our base weights of $50. Compare $50 with the original gross domestic product of 30, and that's going to be a percentage increase of 66.7%. 50 minus 30 divided by 30 is a percentage increase of 2/3, or 66 2/3%. However, if we do the same calculation from year one to year two, and we use the year two prices as our base weights, we wind up with a different percentage altogether. Let's go back and look at the year one quantities of 10 apples and 10 oranges. And now let's use the year two prices as our base weights, $1 per apple and $1 per orange. That is, if we go back and look at the original year's output of apples and oranges and weight those outputs by the year two prices, we wind up with a real GDP of $20. That is, in terms of year two prices, the gross domestic product, the output of this country, was worth $20 in year one, measured in year two prices. So the change in real gross domestic product is from $20, the year one output, to $30, the year two output. Notice you're comparing 2 years for which you're using the same prices, $1 per apple, $1 per orange. And using those weights, the real GDP increased from $20 to $30. That's a 50% increase. See, you got a bigger percentage increase when you use the price of $2 per orange, because the higher price put a heavier weight on the change in output of oranges. Well, there's something kind of messy about this. We don't like the idea that you get a different answer depending on whether you start in year one or year two. This is confusing, and it makes the concept of real gross domestic product less useful. So what the Bureau of Economic Analysis has done since 1995 is to try to correct for this percentage oddity problem by using neither $2, the year one price, or $1, the year two price, but using some number in between, that is a weighted average of the 2-year prices, that makes the percentage change more consistent. That is, gives you the same percentage change whether you use the year one prices or the year two prices. You don't use either price. You use something in between. So whether you're moving forward or backwards, you get the same percentage change. And that's definitely an improvement, and it avoids the problem with percentages that we described earlier. This problem comes up frequently in economics. Percentages are sometimes a messy thing to deal with, especially whenever you're looking at different base years as possible candidates for calculating the percentage. But here's a simple explanation of how you wind up with a problem with percentage changes depending on which year you select as your base. We've said before that the gross domestic product can be calculated by two different methods. The method that we looked at carefully before was the expenditure method, adding up the spending plans of all the sectors of the economy to calculate the total output of the economy. But there's another way to calculate the output of the economy, and that's looking at all of the income that's created when sellers do these transactions with buyers who are spending money. This is called the income approach. And income is just as good a way of calculating gross domestic product as looking at spending. Suppose now it's your job to figure out the relationship between income in our economy and the gross domestic product. How would you add up all the income that's received, and what adjustments would you have to make the connection between what we commonly call income and the total market value of all final goods and services produced in our economy in a year? Well, let's start with the money that's available for you to spend, the money that's available for households to spend. What do we have to do to get from our disposable income to some broader notion of our personal income? What you have to do first is take your disposable income and add back in all of the money that you've paid in personal income taxes. Now you've got personal income, the money before taxes that's available to spend. Well, how do you get from here to a broader measure of national income? What are the other factors that influence the money that's available for people when they make spending decisions? The first thing that you're going to want to do is to subtract out transfer payments, any money that the government has given you. And you're going to want to add back in all of the things you gave the government. That is, add back in Social Security contributions, the taxes that businesses paid, corporate income taxes, add back in undistributed corporate profits, that is money that business kept for itself, and this gives you what we call national income. This is the total amount of money that was received in the United States by the factors of production. Let's divide that into its various categories, that is, who actually received this income. The biggest category was employee compensation. That adds up to about $7.4 trillion, money that was paid to labor. The second component is proprietors' income, that is, profits, and that adds up to about $654 billion. Rent on land adds up to about $142 billion, and interest payments to people who have lent capital adds up to about $476 billion. Finally, corporate profits adds up to $879 billion. Those are the components of our national income. Those are the payments that the factors of production receive as a result of the transactions that are done when goods and services are trading hands. That's where the gross domestic product winds up. But we still aren't all the way back to a connection between income and gross domestic product. There are other factors that we have to add back in before we've accounted for all the value that was created in our economy. The next thing we have to do is we have to add back in the indirect business taxes that businesses paid in the course of doing these transactions. Sales and excise taxes, tariffs, and other taxes that were levied on the transactions. That money was paid off to the government. It was siphoned out of the circular flow. We've got to put it back in order to make a connection between income and gross domestic product. The second thing that we have to account for is depreciation. That is, some of the goods and services that we produced in our economy simply went to replace other goods and services that had worn out. In particular, plant, equipment, other things that businesses use, tools that wore out with use have to be replaced. And if we add that depreciation back in, then we get a more accurate measure of the total output of the economy. And finally, net foreign factor income, that is the money that we paid to foreign factors operating in the United States that helped produce the GDP but weren't counted in national income when we added up the receipts of American labor, capital, entrepreneurs, and landowners. So let's see now if we can show this very clearly. If you take gross domestic product, that is the total output of the economy, Y, and you subtract from that the capital that depreciated, then what you're left with is a measure called net domestic product. This is the output of your economy after you've set aside some of it to account for depreciation. If you take net domestic product and you subtract from that the income that was paid to foreign factors, as well as indirect business taxes that were paid, the sales taxes, excise taxes, customs duties, and other things, then what you have left is national income. And national income means the receipts of American entrepreneurs, that is business owners, labor, capital, and landowners. Then if you take national income and you subtract from it Social Security contributions, corporate profits taxes, undistributed corporate profits, and you add back in transfer payments, then what you have is personal income. That is what people are able to spend on goods and services, but you still have to subtract personal income taxes before you get to the final measure of disposable personal income. That is what people are able to spend whenever they go to the grocery store. So you can see it's a complicated matter getting between income and output. But if you're careful and you are consistent in taking account of all of the ways in which income leaks into and out of the circular flow, you can see that there is a connection between income, that is what you receive, and spending, that is what you buy at the store. Both of these are valid methods for calculating gross domestic product. Now, as we go forward, we're going to be thinking more often about the expenditures approach, because we're going to be interested in how these different components of spending are related to employment, output, prices, interest rates, and other variables in the macroeconomy. But keep in mind that anytime I show you the letter Y, I am referring to output, which is someone's income and someone else's spending. Y can be used interchangeably to mean these three things: the output of an economy, the total spending on output, and the income received by factors of production in that economy. When you read the newspaper or listen to the radio, you'll come across terms like gross domestic product and gross national product and real GDP. What do these terms mean and how important are they? Let's start with the definition of gross domestic product. And I'm going to say this definition very carefully because each phrase in the definition is important. The gross domestic product is the market value of all final goods and services produced in a country in a given period of time. Let's look at each phrase. We start with the market value. Market value means that gross domestic product is measured in terms of money, what people have paid for the goods and services that they have purchased. Market price means that we use for this calculation the actual price at which these transactions occur. So if I buy an apple for 50 cents, I've added 50 cents to gross domestic product. The next phrase, of all. And here you have to wonder, where does the government get all of these statistics? Well, these statistics come from reports of businesses, most of whom are paying taxes. So the gross domestic product is going to rely on reports, which means that activities that are being hidden from the government are probably not showing up in measures of the gross domestic product. So of all refers to legally transacted trades. The third phrase, final. Final means goods and services that are purchased by households for their enjoyment. So for instance, when I buy this apple at the store, this is a final good and goes into the calculation of GDP. On the other hand, if I'm producing auto frames and I sell an auto frame to General Motors, that's not a final good because that auto frame is then incorporated into a new car body and sold to a household by General Motors as part of an automobile. So the car frame that I sold to General Motors was not a final good, it was an intermediate good. It became part of their production process. The car frame doesn't go into gross domestic product until the car is sold. And the car's sales price is added to GDP, and that included the frame that I sold to General Motors. This final goods and services avoids double counting. The next phrase is goods and services. That is, all goods and services are part of GDP. Haircuts, apples, bananas, massages, films, vacations, all goods and services that are provided. Everywhere there is money changing hands in exchange for value, that becomes part of the calculation of the value of output in our economy. The next phrase, produced. And this means that we're trying to record only what is being produced this year. For instance, if I buy your used car, that doesn't figure into GDP because that car was part of GDP years ago when it was a new car. If I go to an antique store and buy a table, that table is not part of GDP because it's an old piece of furniture. But the antique dealer, who I'm paying for his appraisal skills and his retail sales effort, that is part of GDP because it's a service that's being provided to me as I purchase an old piece of furniture. So only that stuff that's produced this year is what we're trying to count when we measure GDP. Within a country, now we come to the distinction between gross domestic product and gross national product. Suppose we have two countries, the United States and the rest of the world. Here we have the nationals of the United States. All of these people are Americans. And here we have the foreign nationals, people whose nationality is citizenship in the foreign country. Now, suppose we have some U.S. nationals who go to work in the foreign country and some foreigners who come to work in the United States. Everyone here is producing goods and services. The difference is that the output that is produced physically within the borders of the United States is called gross domestic product. That's the output that's produced domestically, even though some of the workers who are contributing to its production are not American nationals. Gross national product, on the other hand, for the United States, refers to the output of all U.S. nationals wherever they are, either in the United States or in foreign countries. So gross national product is the output of all U.S. nationals, wherever in the world they happen to be. The difference then between gross domestic product and gross national product is the difference between the output of U.S. nationals working abroad and the output of foreign nationals working in the United States. Finally, in a given period of time, when we measure the output of an economy, we focus on a given period of time, usually 1 year. The gross domestic product of the United States is right now about $8 trillion, which means over the course of the year, we produce new final goods and services that are traded in legal markets for an amount of about $8 trillion. Now, that's gross domestic product. The next thing that we want to distinguish is the difference between nominal gross domestic product and real gross domestic product. Nominal gross domestic product refers to the dollar value of all of these transactions that are occurring right now out there in the economy. So if I go and I pay $1 for a pizza, that's contributing $1 to gross domestic product. However, next year that same pizza might cost $2. Well, there's no more pizza produced. We're just spending more money because the price is higher. And it would seem misleading to say that in some sense there's more stuff just because more money is being spent. This is where the concept of real GDP comes from. Real GDP attempts to measure the output of the economy in terms of physical goods and services. That's the actual physical output of the economy, the amount of stuff that we're actually making. Real gross domestic product seeks to hold constant the effect of changing prices, to give us a sense of how much additional stuff, how much additional real goods and services the economy is producing. Remember, the term nominal refers to measures that are calculated in money. The term real refers to measures that are calculated in physical goods and services. So let's do an example then that distinguishes between the real and the nominal GDP. Let's consider an economy that produces only two goods, apples and bananas. And in this economy, let's calculate the gross domestic product as well as the real gross domestic product in 3 different years. Let's suppose that in the first year, the year 2000, that there are 2 apples produced and that the price of an apple is $1. I'm going to put a dollar sign here to remind us that whenever we're talking about prices, we're talking about nominal variables. Let's suppose that there are 3 bananas produced and the price of a banana is $2 per banana. So the gross domestic product in the year 2000 is $1 times 2 apples, or $2, plus $2 a banana times 3 bananas, or $6. 6 plus 2 is a gross domestic product of $8. Now let's look at the year 2001. The gross domestic product here has changed because the quantities of apples, the quantities of bananas produced have changed, and the prices of both goods are now different than before. So to calculate the gross domestic product, $1.50 per apple times 4 apples gives us a total of $6 spent on apples, and $2.50 per banana times 4 bananas purchased gives us a total of $10 on bananas. 10 plus 6 is $16. That's the gross domestic product in the year 2001. And finally, the gross domestic product in the year 2002 is $2 an apple times 5 apples, or $10, times $3 a banana times 5 bananas, or $15. $15 and $10 together is $25 for the gross domestic product. Now, how do we compare the output of our economy in those successive years? Output is changing, but so are prices. How do we get a measure of the increased physical output of our economy, the increased real output? Well, we get that measure by holding constant the prices. And we pick a base year and we use that year's prices in the calculation of GDP for the successive years. That's how we come up with a measure of GDP that holds prices constant. Watch closely. Let's choose the year 2000 as our base year, and let's circle the prices of apples and bananas in those 2 years, because I'm going to use these as the prices as I calculate gross domestic product in the year 2001 and 2002. The real gross domestic product in the year 2001 is now $1, the base year price of apples, times 4 apples, the quantity actually produced in 2001. That gives me a total of $4 on apples spent in 2001 using the base year price. Next, let's go to bananas. $2 is our base year price, times 4 bananas actually produced in 2001, so we have $8 worth of bananas produced using the base year price. $8 plus $4 is a total real gross domestic product of $12 in the year 2001. See, before when we used the actual numbers for the year 2001, we got $16. But that overstated the increase in physical output because part of that increased number came from higher prices. Using the base year prices, it appears that gross domestic product, real gross domestic product, has increased by only 50%, from 8 to 12, rather than doubling from 8 to 16. Next, let's calculate real gross domestic product for the year 2002. Start with the base year prices. Once again, $1 times 5 actual apples in 2002 is $5. $2, the base year price, times 5 bananas is $10 worth of bananas in 2002 at the base year price. 10 plus $5 together gives us $15. That's the real gross domestic product using the base year prices. So there you have it, a simple method for calculating real gross domestic product. Hold prices constant at some base year, and use those constant prices whenever you multiply by the actual physical output to calculate real GDP. Real GDP's changes are a measure of the increase in the actual physical output of the economy. Now, this gives rise to a number that we call the Gdp Deflator. The Gdp Deflator is the ratio of a year's actual GDP, that is, the GDP measured in terms of current year prices, to the GDP measured in terms of base year prices. This gives a notion of how the price level has changed. And the change in the price level is weighted according to the physical output of the different goods produced. So for instance, if we wanted to calculate the GDP deflator for the year 2001, we take the actual GDP for that year, which is calculated using 2001 prices. And that GDP, as we calculated earlier, is $1.50 times 4, or $6, plus $2.50 times 4, or $10. $16 is the gross domestic product for 2001. But using the base year prices, we calculated that the real GDP for that year is $12. Now the ratio of $16, the GDP, to $12, the real GDP, using base year prices, that ratio is 16 divided by 12, or 1.333, 1 1/3. Multiply that number by 100, and you have the GDP deflator. The GDP deflator is the ratio of the nominal GDP to the real GDP multiplied by 100. So in this case, it's 133 1/3. That tells you how much prices have increased relative to the base year. They've gone up about 33%. Let's now look at the GDP deflator for the year 2002. Take the actual GDP, which is 25, divide it by the real GDP, calculated with the base year prices, which is 15, and you get 5/3, or 1.666, 1 2/3, or about 1.67. Multiply by 100, and you get the GDP deflator, 167, which tells you that prices have risen now about 67% since the year 2000. The GDP deflator is a change in prices. It's a kind of average change in prices across the economy, where the average is calculated using as weights the amount of physical goods. That is, the importance of the change in apple prices depends on how many apples are produced. The importance of the change in banana prices in influencing the GDP deflator depends on the quantity of bananas actually produced. But if you look at the GDP's deflator, the GDP deflator's change over time, it gives you one measure of inflation in the economy. How fast are prices rising? Or are prices even falling? Recall that the formula for the GDP deflator is the nominal GDP for a given year divided by the real GDP for that same year multiplied by the number 100. Well, since this is true, we can do a little algebraic manipulation and come up with another formula for calculating the real GDP. If we know the GDP deflator for a given year, we can take the nominal GDP for that year, divide by the year's GDP deflator, multiply by 100, and that will give us the real GDP. For instance, if the nominal GDP for a given year is $8 trillion and the GDP deflator for that year is 200, then taking 200 and dividing into 8 trillion, multiplying by 100, gives us $4 trillion for the real GDP, or the real GDP output measured in terms of base year prices. A little algebra gives us another expression for real GDP. So next time you hear these terms, GDP, real GDP, gross national product, you'll know what the newspaper is talking about. It's discussing the output of the economy within a given period of time, the total market value of all final goods and services produced in a country in a given year. And that may or may not be related to the standard of living of the people who live in that country. That's an interesting question to consider. The gross domestic product is the market value of all final goods and services produced in a country in a given period of time, usually 1 year. Let's look at some gross domestic product figures from 1998. These numbers measure the real GDP in each of the countries. Real meaning that the prices used are those from 1996, and the quantities of output used are from 1998. Using these numbers, the United States had a real GDP of about $8.75 trillion in 1998. Japan's real GDP is about $3.8 trillion. France's is about $1.4 trillion, and so forth. Looking at these numbers, you might ask, well, what should I make of these? What do they mean? One thing you can do with these numbers is look at how they change from year to year, and that's the information that's reflected in the growth rate of real GDP. The growth rates are now shown in the table, and as you look them over, you immediately notice that Mexico has a more rapid growth rate than does the United States. Well, what does that tell you? What it really tells you is that Mexico's growth rate is more rapid because Mexico is starting from a smaller base. A given absolute change in output in Mexico translates into a larger percentage change because Mexico's starting point is a smaller real GDP than the GDP in the United States. The given change in the United States translates into a smaller percentage. Whenever you hear people in the press talking about economic growth, they're usually talking about the change in real GDP, or the percentage growth rate of real GDP. Again, though, what do you make of this? When you hear that a country has a rapid growth rate, does that mean that the standard of living of its citizens is improving? Or that Mexicans are getting better off 3 or 4 times as fast as our people who live in the United States? Well, this depends on how you interpret the numbers. Let's divide all of the numbers in this column by the populations of the respective countries. That gives us per capita GDP, per capita real GDP in 1998. First thing you notice is that 2 countries, Switzerland and Japan, have higher per capita real gross domestic products than does the United States. Well, what does this tell us? Would you rather live in Japan or Switzerland? Is the typical Swiss or Japanese better off than the typical American? This, once again, depends on what the numbers are telling us. Gross domestic product numbers began to be compiled in the middle of the last century, that is around the time of World War II, when countries were concerned in measuring their productive capacity. That is, how many machines, how much output could be brought to bear quickly on the war effort. What was the productive capacity of our economy? Nowadays, however, these numbers are used to represent the ability of goods and services to provide satisfaction to the citizens of an economy. That is, there's usually an implicit link made in the press when we're talking about these numbers between the gross domestic product of a country and its standard of living or its quality of life. But is that an obvious link? Does the gross domestic product really tell us whether people in a country are better off or not? Let's consider several qualifications to the gross domestic product that will occur to us on reflection. That is, why might the gross domestic product not tell us what we want to know about quality of life in a country? The first problem with the gross domestic product is that there are things that are important to our standard of living that are left out of its number. The first is leisure. Does it matter if the gross domestic product has increased by 20% if we're all working so hard that we're tired and unhappy? That is, one of the things that we value is our vacation time, our time to sit and read a book. And yet leisure time does not show up in any form in the gross domestic product. In fact, on the contrary, you can argue that when gross domestic product increases, it could be because people are working harder or working longer hours, and that has to be traded off against their lost leisure. So leisure activities don't show up in the number. A second qualification is environmental quality. We're all concerned about clean water, breathable air, and beautiful landscapes, and yet none of these have market values that show up in the gross domestic product. Therefore, whenever business activity increases the final value of goods and services traded in markets, but at the same time diminishes the quality of air and water, we get an increase in the gross domestic product, but perhaps a reduction in our standard of life. The third question is about goods that are not traded in markets. What about child care? What about production in the household? What about meals put on the table and redecoration of houses and things like that through effort that occurs at home? Well, all of these things make our life better, and yet they don't show up directly in the gross domestic product because they're not traded in markets. Another concern is the quality of products. Think about television sets today compared to television sets 40 years ago. Not only are the television sets of today of higher quality and more fun to watch and providing better and clearer pictures, but their prices are also lower because technological progress has made it easier to produce these goods than back in the 1950s. Television sets are better and less expensive, but this doesn't show up in the gross domestic product because the gross domestic product doesn't provide explicitly for changes in the quality of products. Finally, there's this whole question of goods and services that are traded that never show up in official statistics at all because people are doing them through barter or other informal transactions, but they are trying to avoid paying taxes. The underground economy may be as much as 10% of our gross domestic product. That is, people engaged in informal activity on which taxes are not paid and records are not kept. So all considered, there's a lot of activity that's increasing our standard of life that never shows up in official statistics. Therefore, the gross domestic product may understate our true quality of life. On the other hand, it may overstate our true quality of life because there's a lot of expenditure that gives us no satisfaction. Consider one example, a lock and key. I bought this at the store to lock my locker at the gym so that no one would steal my clothes. Well, did this make me better off? Well, given that there's crime, I'm now protected, so I worry less. But do I want to live in a world where I have to spend a lot of money on locks and keys and security systems and car alarms? Also, because of the stress of modern life, we may spend more money on medication. Also, because of the difficulty of maintaining relationships in a stressful business world, there may be more divorce lawyers. All of these expenditures wind up increasing gross domestic product, but they don't necessarily make us happier. Therefore, our quality of life may be lower even as our total spending increases. Another concern with per capita real GDP as a measure of quality of life is that it doesn't include other things that make for a good society, such as the distribution of income. If one person has a whole lot of money and everybody else has nothing, you might get a high average, that is a high per capita GDP, and yet the income distribution is all messed up. One person has everything, and therefore there are a lot of people who may be living in misery and poverty. Not only are we concerned about the people who are miserable and poor, but we're also concerned about what kind of society that makes for. Do you want to live in a society where a very small number of people are very rich, while most people are discontent because they can't meet their basic needs? Some measure of the income distribution might be important to a real measure of quality of life, but we don't get any of that from our gross domestic product statistics. Another concern is infant mortality. How many children are living out of childhood? What about adult literacy? What about life expectancy? All of these measures are important. What about the status of women in your society? What about educational opportunities? All of the things that we think make for a good society, none of them show up in this one-dimensional number that we call gross domestic product. Therefore, there are a lot of efforts now on the part of other groups to conduct measures of quality of life that are taking as their point of departure the gross domestic product, but trying to adjust it for the things that it leaves out and other things that it should include, or things that should be omitted. One of these is the United Nations Quality of Life Index, which looks at educational opportunities, infant mortality, adult literacy. And when it does, it reorders the country. The United States slips down in the list, and other countries that might surprise you rise up higher. Another interesting effort is on the part of a group in San Francisco called Redefining Progress. Redefining Progress has conducted what it calls a Genuine Progress Index. The Genuine Progress Index includes non-market production. That is, it tries to estimate the amount of value that's created from childcare and production in the household. It also treats the depletion of natural resources as a reduction in our capital. It tries to take explicit account of the amount of pollution that's created, and it knocks out of the GDP expenditures that are simply trying to clean up messes that we created in the process of production. Other things that it does is to take account of the income distribution and adjust the GDP downwards when the income distribution becomes more skewed. And it considers the drawback of living on foreign assets. Are we becoming more dependent on foreigners lending us money? The genuine progress indicator has actually been declining since the mid-1970s. That is, if you take out the money that we're spending on locks and keys and security systems and divorce lawyers, and if you adjust for the amount of pollution that we're creating, according to Redefining Progress, our real standard of living has been falling since the mid-1970s. Well, there you have it. A concern about how to measure quality of life and standard of living. And it turns out that the gross domestic product, which was created to measure your capacity for conducting war, not surprisingly, doesn't always do a great job of telling you whether your people are better off. I've just come home from a hard day of work and I'm hungry, but the cupboard is bare. Now, ordinarily, I'd go out to my car, drive to the grocery store, and do my shopping. But today in the mail, I got this flyer that says that I can now do all of my grocery shopping online through a new service. Why not sit here in the comfort of my favorite chair with the laptop in front of me and do my shopping virtually? Let's see, I need milk, and why not cookies? And if I'm going to eat cookies, I better get some broccoli, too. Now, ordinarily, I'd get to the grocery store, get my shopping cart, and start loading it with the things of which I'm going to make my meals in the coming week. But here, I enter the grocery list, and someone at the store bags the groceries for me, drives up in a delivery van, and brings them to my front porch. This is an example of what economists call electronic commerce, or e-commerce, commerce that originates online. This is a growing chunk of the United States economy. About 1% of all retail transactions in the year 1999 occurred online. By the year 2000, it's estimated that at least 2% of all retail transactions will occur in this way, and the percentage is just going to keep growing. In 1998, only about 24% of all businesses sold goods online, that is, were participating in e-commerce. Nowadays, it's estimated that that number may be as high as 57%. You can see that electronic commerce is a bit of a sensation. It's rapidly becoming part of our life. So how do I decide whether I'm going to go to the grocery store in person or whether I'm going to sit here and do my shopping online? What are the advantages to be derived from either choice? Well, if I do my shopping online, I can, first of all, save the hassle of driving to the store. I can save the time of walking down the aisles. If I really want low-priced groceries, too, I can sit here and look among several different grocery stores competing with one another and buy my goods from whichever offers the lower prices. So e-commerce offers me competition, it offers me convenience, it saves me time. On the other hand, if I want to thump the melons and squeeze the bread and carefully read the labels, if I want the help from the guy at the meat counter, if I want my usual friendly chat with the checkout guy, Joe, who I see every week, then I have to show up at the store in person and actually inspect the goods for myself. If I want the experience of shopping, if I want to be involved, then I still have to go to the bricks and mortar facility. Think about how e-commerce is changing the way in which we do our shopping. Books, for instance. People buy more and more books online, looking for the lowest prices, looking for recommendations, all those things that e-commerce does well. So, what's happening at bookstores these days? You don't see people there just picking up a copy of a book at the lowest price. Instead, you see people who like the feel of books, who like to thumb through the books, who want to browse and meet other people who hang out at bookstores. The main thing you get at bookstores nowadays is coffee. The experience of shopping for books now has been divided into two different experiences. The virtual experience, where you get the lowest prices online, and the experience of a bookstore with all of its smells and association. This is probably going to happen increasingly as electronic commerce insinuates itself into our lives. If what you really want is commodities, you can get them cheaper and more conveniently online. If what you really want is experiences, you get them in person. Also, taxes. Nowadays, we're living in a kind of wonderland where transactions on the internet are not taxed, whereas If you go to the grocery store, you have to pay a sales tax, and most states and counties depend on this sales tax to fund schools and provide public goods. It probably is only a matter of time before internet transactions are taxed as well. Although this is being bitterly debated in Congress, there are some people who believe that the internet should remain a tax-free zone to encourage its growth, while others say that if you let the internet be tax-free, that regular bricks and mortar businesses will just set up kiosks and fake that they're e-commerce so they can evade taxes. This issue is yet to be decided. Meanwhile, almost 90% of college students are looking for jobs this summer online. E-commerce is beginning to include the labor market as well as the market for goods and services. Transactions costs are falling, and that means it's cheaper and more convenient to get all the things that you want, except the experience of going to the grocery store and walking the aisles and talking with your friends and the help and experiencing the goods firsthand. There's some kinds of experiences that are still best had in the real world. So, what am I going to do? I love going to the grocery store, but anymore I'll be thinking of going to the grocery store like going to the bookstore, going to the movies, or taking a walk, something that I do when I want the experience or need to interact with my shopping in a particular way. This evening, I'm a bit rushed, so I'm going to pay for the service of having someone else pick out the goods for me. And I'm going to trust their judgment and their reputation for picking good quality and matching my wants precisely. And then they'll do the driving for me and bring the groceries to the door, and who knows, they may even smile and we have a friendly transaction on the porch instead of at the checkout counter. E-commerce is becoming part of our lives, and our commerce is going to become community in some cases and commodities in others. But we, as individuals, will do what economists believe we always do, make rational decisions about which method of shopping is most satisfying in which case.
Now, we've talked about GDP as a good measure of how much is being produced in an economy, but we haven't really talked about whether GDP is a measure of welfare. Now again, it measures how much is being produced. And generally when we see increases in GDP, we're talking about increases in standards of living, and people are thought to be better off. But there are many shortcomings of GDP as a measure of welfare. First of all, you can't count and measure housework and childcare. While these are very important services that are being produced, if they're produced in the home and not traded in a market, we're unable to account for it in GDP, so it's not part of measured GDP. Also, leisure. Leisure is not counted and produced as a good or service, but we might argue that a country that has more leisure is better off. So if GDP is rising but leisure is going down, when we're measuring welfare or well-being of citizens of a country, we might say they might be worse off. So it's not clear whether an increase in GDP is going to increase well-being. Also, the underground economy. Lots of goods and services are produced in the underground economy, but since they're illegal, either because they're illegal practices or they're happening to avoid paying taxes, they're not measured, and hence not part of measured GDP. Additionally, we want to look at pollution when we're talking about social welfare or well-being. If we increase GDP and increase production, but significantly increase pollution at the same time, we might argue that we're worse off. How much are we talking about here? Well, the world underground economy in 2002-2003, estimates of how large this portion that's not being measured ranges from, in Europe, the United States, and Japan, 17% of reported GDP is the estimated size of the underground economy, all the way up to 41% in Africa and Central and South America. So while we think GDP is a very good measure of production, it's not a perfect measure of production because it doesn't account for household production and childcare and the underground economy. It also isn't a perfect measure of social well-being or welfare because it doesn't account for leisure and pollution. We talked earlier about the differences between real and nominal GDP. Well, let's look at an example of how we might measure real versus nominal GDP. Remember, nominal GDP is GDP in the value of production in current dollars, where real GDP is in constant dollars. How might this work? Suppose we looked at an economy where two goods were produced, cars and computers. And we know the price of cars and computers in two different years, 2011 and 2012. Well, when we look at this, we can see that there are more cars produced in 2012 than in 2011, and more computers produced in 2012 than 2011. And we see that cars are more expensive and computers are the same price. So if we were trying to figure out what nominal GDP is in each year, what we would do is we would say, how much does it cost to buy the cars that are produced? It would be 4 times 10,000, or $40,000 worth of cars, plus $5,000 worth of computers. So we'd have 40,000 plus 5,000, or $45,000 worth of production in 2011. This would be nominal GDP. Now what about in 2012? In 2012, there's 5 cars, and they cost $12,000. So 5 cars at $12,000 each is $60,000. And there's 3 computers at $5,000 each. That's $15,000. So nominal GDP in 2011 is $75,000. Right? So these will go to these different years, and again, that's nominal GDP. But why did it go up? Did it go up because we produced more, or because prices went up? You can't really tell. So we want to look at real GDP instead. So real GDP, you have to fix the prices somewhere. That's why we call it constant prices. Suppose we choose 2011 as the base year. 2011 will be the year that we use the prices from. So we'll figure out how much would it cost to buy what's produced in 2011 using 2011 prices. And we know that's going to be $45,000. What if we looked at the production in 2012 and valued it with the prices in 2011? Then we would have 5 cars that cost $10,000 each, and that would be $50,000, and 3 computers that cost $5,000 each, that would be $15,000, or $65,000 worth of goods and services. And we know that that's gone up because production went up, because we kept prices constant at the base year prices. So when we look at real GDP and nominal GDP over time, it's more useful to look at real GDP, because we know that if it has gone up or down, it's because production has gone up or down. Nominal GDP goes up when prices go up, but it also goes up when production goes up. So we want to be very careful and look at real GDP over time. Now, once we can compare nominal GDP and real GDP, we know the only differences are changes in prices. So we can produce a price index called the Gdp Deflator. It's an index that measures how the prices of goods and services included in GDP have changed over time. How do we do that? Well, the Gdp Deflator for any point in time is equal to the nominal GDP at that point in time divided by real GDP at that point in time times 100. And that'll give us a price index at that point in time, and it's called the GDP Price Deflator. All right, now let's look at one way we can measure a nation's macroeconomic activity. We're going to use the production approach to add up gross domestic product. What is gross domestic product? That's the total market value of final goods and services produced within an economy in a given year. Now, all these parts of the definition are very important. We look at the total market value because this allows us to add up different goods and services by looking at their dollar value. We look at only final goods and services to avoid double counting of intermediate goods. If we counted a tire when it was purchased to put on a new car, then also counted it when it was purchased as part of the car, we would count that tire twice. So instead, we only count final goods and services, In that example, we would only count the tire when it was part of the purchase of the car. And so we look at all the market value of all final goods and services within an economy in a given year. That tells us how much is being produced in the economy that year. It gives us some idea of how much labor is being hired, how much capital is being used, how efficiently the economy is working when we look at gross domestic product over time. Now we want to be able to differentiate between two different measures of GDP, where real GDP is a measure of GDP that controls for changes in prices. This is GDP that does not go up when prices go up. It only goes up when production goes up. Nominal GDP is the value of GDP in current dollars. Nominal GDP can rise for two reasons. One, prices could rise, so the price of everything we were producing goes up, nominal GDP would rise. If we had output, actually production of goods and services going up, nominal GDP would rise as well. So since we look at GDP as trying to figure out how much we're producing, a better measure of that is real GDP, because that only rises if output rises. And when we look at economic growth, this is increases in real GDP in an economy over long periods of time. This is a graph of U.S. real GDP from 1930 to 2011. And we can see that it generally has gone up over the last 80 years. And in fact, we could draw a line through it and try to get as close as possible. A smooth line going up. And it's not a perfect line, but you can see that generally real GDP has risen. And now when we look at long-run macroeconomic questions, which we're going to do later in the book, it's going to be questions about what makes this line go up over long periods of time. When we look at short-run macroeconomic questions, it's going to be questions about the business cycle, recessions and expansions. And so we would look at the Great Depression, and we look at the boom in the 1990s or the recession in 2007, and try and explain why actual output rises and falls above what we might call potential output, which we'll learn what that means later on. So we have two types of questions in macroeconomics. Long-run macroeconomic questions would talk about how come GDP rises and how fast it rises over long periods, and short-run macroeconomic questions, which talk about the business cycle. Now, when we add up GDP using the production approach, we're going to look at what types of goods are being produced, and we're going to separate them into four different components. The different components of GDP depend on who is buying it. So we have consumption expenditures, which are purchased by consumers. We have private investment expenditures, which are purchased by firms, and we're going to see that this is made up of different categories of investment expenditures, but one of the most important one is plants and equipment, which is the capital stock, which increases the productive capacity of the economy. We have government purchases by federal, state, and local governments. And we have net exports, which are the net purchases by the foreign sector, or domestic exports minus domestic imports. All goods and services which are produced are either consumption, private investment expenditures, government purchases, or net exports. So if we add all those up, we have a total of how much is being produced, called gross domestic product. Give you some idea of what we're talking about in terms of dollars. If we look at the third quarter of 2011 and we annualize these, what is U.S. GDP? Well, it was $15 trillion, or 15,000 billion dollars. 10 trillion, or almost 11 trillion of it, was made up of consumption expenditures. So the vast majority of what we produce in the United States is for consumption expenditures. Private investment expenditures were almost $2 trillion, government purchases a little over $3 trillion, and net exports negative $562 billion. So when we add all this up, we get a very useful equation. When we talk about GDP, and we're often going to use the letter Y to represent GDP, we have GDP as consumption plus investment plus government expenditures plus net exports. When we add all that up, we get an equation where Y equals C plus I plus G plus net exports. This will be a very useful thing for you to remember as we move forward in this course.